The year 476 is commonly accepted as the end of the era of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages. By this time, the culture of the Roman Empire had collapsed, and the art and knowledge of the classical era were for the most part lost. The new dominant culture in Europe was formed of many diverse Germanic tribes. Their art was simple and crude, as the turbulent times they lived in made other concerns more immediately important. As the medieval era slowly became more settled, however, people began to construct greater and greater artistic works. Some works were extensions of earlier crafts they had, while most were carefully copied from Roman styles. Due to their similarity to older Roman designs, this era became known as the Romanesque. There is no distinct division between this early medieval style and later eras. As the years progressed, however, medieval artists began to develop new and innovative techniques and styles. Around the year 1100, their innovations had become a style of its own, developed beyond what they had preserved from the Roman Empire, a uniquely medieval and European style known as the Gothic Era. The greatest similarity between the arts in the Gothic era is perhaps their lack of similarity. Each art style had developed from very different sources. Some were influenced by classical styles, while some were built off from older Germanic origins, and some were just developed from scratch. Writing was a fairly rare art, as there were few who could copy it or read it. Most who could were focused on older texts preserved from the Roman Empire. In the Gothic era, writers like Geoffrey Chaucer and Dante Alighieri began to write stories based off the structure of famous Roman epics, but with influences from common medieval culture. The epic structures and learned classical references of the Canterbury Tales and the Divine Comedy were uniquely mixed with contemporary ideas of courtly love and references to scandals and common troubles of the day. Gothic painters had mostly lost any connection to Roman art. Paintings were quick to degrade and hard to carry around. Still, the influence of Roman and other classical frescoes and mosaic work can be seen in many medieval artworks. The realism and styling of the cultures, though, were for the most part forgotten. Some painters focused on manuscript illustration, a work that soon became a distinct art form and one of the main areas of innovation in painting. Music was also unrelated to these older styles. Instead, the music of the Gothic era was based mostly on the slow development of religious chants and hymns, and of country tunes based off old spoken roots. Little was written down from that time, so the similarities between music was mostly based on traveling singers and the universal limitations of all musicians. Sculpture had perhaps more classical basis than other forms of art. The difficulty and tangibility of the form allowed for very skilled artists and better work than painting for the most part. It also relegated most of its use to augment expensive architecture builds or for religious works where there was lots of money. Which brings us to architecture itself. The Gothic era began with several breakthroughs in building techniques, and architecture would be the pride of artists and commoners throughout the later Middle Ages. Departing radically from the Roman-inspired architecture of previous eras, the Gothic era was able to build enormous buildings with big vaulted ceilings and bright windows. Combined with the stained glass and sculpture, the great buildings of the Gothic era are feats hardly matched by today's developments. Although the art forms were for the most part independent of each other, there were several similarities. One of these would be the themes in artworks of the time. One major focus in Gothic art was religious art. This was partially due to the great ability the church had to sponsor artists at the time, but also due to cultural influences. Many artworks explored the battle between good and evil, the appearance of virtues and vices, and the influences of religious forces in common life. Similarly, many arts explored the nature of romance and other abstract concepts too, often looking for personifications and allegories of these concepts. Artists focused much on the spiritual and metaphorical parts of scenes instead of the purely physical. For example, more important figures in portraits may be portrayed as unnaturally larger, to show their importance. The last main focus in art of the time was the vulgar. This art was developed straight from the influences of common gossip and discussion, scandals, complaints, comic imbecility, vice, and other such concepts. It could be said that this focus is in all periods of art, yet the Gothic era is unique in how it is combined with the other focuses. The common and vulgar elements of art were often mixed in undiluted with the most spiritual or ideal concepts, such as in the Canterbury Tales, where the vulgar stories of the reeve and the cook are placed side by side with pious sermons and Chaucer's retraction for what he may have said vulgar. Another trait that all art forms shared in the Gothic era was their lack. This was perhaps the least evident in writing, but still very visible. There were very few established genres and styles in writing to choose between. What was written either in ancient Latin or in various vernacular languages, languages that still had little standardization of spelling or grammar. Printing had not yet been invented. Its invention at the tail end of the era in 1453 was one of the major signs towards its end, and few would be able to read the works that could be copied out by hand for any mass production. Similar lack can be seen in all art forms of the era. Paintings were made with poor quality materials, and many of the often used techniques were at the time lost or forgotten. The most major of these would be the techniques for creating realistic perspective. Without these techniques to provide a three-dimensional look to the works, many of the artworks have a very distinct flat look to them. Sculptures were similarly crudely made. There are few techniques still in use for crafting in certain materials, such as metals. The sculptures that were made were often slowly and laboriously constructed, and still roughly designed compared to modern standards. Music most noticeably lacked many of the main instruments associated with it today. Instruments such as the oboe, the violin, and even the piano had not been invented yet. The notation used to write the music played was complicated and archaic, and many of the standard harmonies and textures of the modern era had not yet been formulated. In the field of architecture, the Gothic era was actually fairly highly advanced. Other than some forgotten techniques from ancient Rome, such as concrete and techniques for building large domes, buildings of the era were perhaps better than ever before. The soaring arches and carefully placed buttresses and columns in Gothic buildings allowed for enormous and brilliant structures. Of course, these building projects were extraordinarily expensive and slow to build. So, while impressive in its highlights, Gothic architecture was unable to make spectacular advancements for most normal works. While artists may have lacked all these techniques, Gothic art is not defined by this. It is a credit to the artist of the time that even without the conveniences of modern techniques, the art of the era shows vivid, diverse, and creative expressions. The simple storylines of Chaucer are enhanced by clean structure, beautiful poetry, and believable characters, which make it still famous today. Paintings, music, and all other forms of art from the time similarly show the dedication and genius behind their creators, even with lack of materials and proper